Cucumbers are a very popular vegetable, and they're a great crop to grow because they can be so high yielding. But I haven't tried growing cucumbers outside yet, as I don't think they would do well in the Irish climate with the cooler temperatures and the higher winds that we tend to get. They do seem happier growing in the warmth and shelter conditions of the polytunnel, where it's also easier to hang them from the polytunnel structure above, which keeps the plants up off the ground and generally leads to better quality cucumbers that are easier to find amongst all the foliage. I generally grow salad varieties of cucumbers that produce the long, juicy fruit that so many people like to eat, but I've also grown a more dual-purpose cucumber in the past that I use to make a sliced sweet pickle. More recently, I've been growing varieties that have been bred specifically for pickling, producing cucumbers with a drier flesh, and the possibility of many more cucumbers being produced on each plant. This year, I explored several different methods for growing these varieties in order to produce lots of really small cucumbers for making pickled gherkins, as well as letting them grow for making different types of pickles, and we were able to harvest a huge amount of pickling cucumbers from these plants. Pickles are not a common thing here in Ireland, and generally not that available in the shops, though this is changing as the population becomes more diverse. Historically, this is not a pickling culture, and there's not a lot of knowledge around about making pickles, and it's even hard to find jars that are big enough and cheap enough for making lots of pickles, which is very different from the culture that I grew up with in Canada. Most of the cucumber varieties that are available for growing here in Ireland are intended to be eaten raw, with juicier flesh that makes them more difficult to make pickles out of, though it's not impossible. In the past, I've grown a variety that I consider to be dual purpose, that produced large fruit with a slightly drier flesh that was quite good for making sliced pickles. But I wanted to try growing varieties that could produce a lot of much smaller cucumbers that I could use for making small whole pickled gherkins, as well as letting them grow a bit for making other types of pickles. I've been experimenting with 2 hybrid varieties for this, and both of them seem to produce cucumbers with a drier flesh and a thinner skin, and seem to be able to produce a much greater number of fruit, but only if I grow them in a different way. The method that I've been using for growing the salad cucumbers involves winding the single main stem up of a length of twine hung from the polytunnel structure. And I would make sure to pinch off all of the side shoots, leaving only a single female flower to grow into one fruit at each leaf node. And for some of the larger varieties, I would remove the immature fruit or female flower from every second leaf node to reduce the number of fruit that the plant had to grow. And these rapidly growing single vines would need to be dropped quite regularly, and I would prune off all of the leaves and developing side shoots at ground level, leaving only leaves and fruit to develop on the upper hanging part of the plant. I've had good success with this common method of heavily pruning closely spaced plants, which is designed to encourage the plants to produce fewer fruit over a longer growing season, which will hopefully be better quality. But I would need to train and prune the plants quite differently in order to encourage them to produce many more smaller cucumbers for pickling. It's hard to find any information about how to grow these cucumber plants in order to get them to produce a huge number of much smaller cucumbers for pickling, especially within the confined space of a polytunnel. I've tried a few different methods in the past, both hanging the plants and allowing them to grow along the soil surface. But this year I decided to do a side-by-side comparison of 2 different methods using the 2 varieties of pickling cucumbers. With one set of the 2 varieties, I planted 14 plants quite close together in a double row and allowed the main vine to climb up a length of twine hung from the polytunnel structure. But I allowed all of the side shoots to develop and only cut them back to prevent them from growing too long. With another batch of 8 plants, 4 from each variety, I planted them at a wider spacing on a longer section of the bed, each of these plants having more than 3 times the area of the hanging plants. And I allowed these plants to grow out over the surface of the bed, only pruning them back to prevent them from growing out over the paths. I also used 2 bent wire frames for some of these plants to grow over, which I had originally created to help support bush bean plants, as I thought that this would help keep the vines up off the soil and make them easier to harvest. So with one set, there were more plants in a smaller space growing vertically, and in the other set, there were fewer plants with larger space to grow horizontally, either over the soil surface or up over a wire frame. And it was interesting to see how they developed and grew, and how much time the different methods took to manage and harvest from. I sowed the seeds in mid-May and transplanted them into the polytunnel 3 weeks later in the first week of June, and I was able to harvest the first small cucumbers from all of the plants in the first week of July, 7 weeks after sowing the seeds. The horizontal plants only needed to be pruned back a few times to prevent them from growing over the paths too much, but it wasn't such a big deal so long as I could get down the paths for harvesting. The plants filled the beds and grew up over the frames quite quickly, with lots of branching and overlapping side shoots. Apart from a bit of pruning and helping the first leaders up onto the top of the wire frames, and a lot of watering and feeding, these plants were easy to manage. But harvesting was more difficult and time-consuming with these plants, searching through the foliage to find all of the small cucumbers before they grew larger than I wanted them to. It was easier to see the cucumbers hanging down below the wire frames, but it was actually more difficult to harvest from these, as I had to work through the holes in the wire frames, and I found myself wishing that they were much higher off the ground so I didn't have to bend down so low. This hanging fruit was better quality compared to the ones lying on the soil surface, especially later in the season when the decaying leaves and cooler temperature and less air movement led to more fruit and vines decaying. The hanging plants took more work every few days to make sure that the growing leader wound up the twine and to prune back the side shoots that were growing too far out. I found it difficult to find a balance between letting all the side shoots grow to produce a greater number of flower clusters, but to also prevent overcrowding and making it more difficult to find all of the cucumbers for harvesting when they were small. And the two varieties seemed to respond differently to this pruning. One variety produced a greater number of flower clusters with more flowers in each cluster, and the other variety produced fewer, and I suspect that it might be better to train and prune each of these varieties in different ways to produce different sized fruit. When these plants grew enough to reach the top of the polytunnel, I lowered them in place, and then pruned out all of the lower leaves and side shoots, clearing the space at the ground level. With many cucumbers growing on the upper parts of the vine, harvesting was easier with less bending over, and it was easier to spot most of the cucumbers before they got too big. So I spent a lot less time harvesting, but more time pruning and winding up these plants. And these plants also overshadowed the adjacent beds a lot more, which is another factor I need to consider. I suspect that these climbing plants would have produced for longer into the autumn than the horizontal growing plants, as it was easier to clean up the plants and remove the decaying leaves and to allow a greater air movement within the vines. Unfortunately, these plants suffered from some feeding issues and became infested with spider mite later in the season, just as the horizontal plants were becoming more of a mess to deal with, so I ended up giving up on both batches by mid-September. At the beginning of the harvest season, I was trying to harvest from all of the plants every 2 or 3 days in order to catch most of the cucumbers at that much smaller size that I needed to make the particular type of pickled gherkin that I wanted to make. This was a lot of work, searching through all of the vines several times a week, especially with the plants that were growing horizontally. In the middle of the season, I was harvesting every 4 or 5 days, which meant that some of the cucumbers got to be quite a bit bigger. And later in the season, as the weather cooled down and I got bored with harvesting, this extended to about once a week. But with all of these harvests, I would pick all of the cucumbers that were of usable size all at the same time, from the smallest gherkins up to the larger ones that already had immature seeds developing inside. In the kitchen, I would pull out the smaller ones for making pickled gherkins, slice up the larger ones for a sweet pickle, and even use some of the medium-sized ones for making a lacto-fermented pickle. Harvesting a mix of sizes all at once made a lot more sense, as I could simply pick any of the cucumbers that were even remotely large enough to use, which would actually extend the time until I needed to harvest again. And I could make more of one type of pickle and less of the other, depending on how fast the growth had been and how long I had waited until the next harvest. And I made a lot of pickles in July and August, which I processed and stored for eating throughout the year. And whenever I felt that I didn't have enough time to make more pickles, I was able to give the harvest to friends who were delighted to be able to make their own. Over the 10-week harvest period, we were able to harvest about 180 kilograms of pickling cucumbers from all of these plants, which is a huge amount. And with the recipes I use, this would translate to about 260 liter or quart jars of pickles. I was able to make enough pickles for ourselves and to give away, and there were plenty of cucumbers to give to friends so that they can pickle for themselves. And all of this was harvested from less than 10 meters of a bed in one of the polytunnels, which translates to a bit less than 8 square meters of bed. I think that is a high yield no matter how you look at it, and from plants that suffered later in the season, which was actually a bit of a relief because I was getting tired from all the harvesting and making pickles. One variety seemed to produce more than the other, and the plants that had more space to grow horizontally produced about 3 times the amount of cucumbers as the same plants growing vertically with less space. But comparing the amount of kilograms per square meter, the difference wasn't so significant. Adding up the harvests as the season progressed, or the yield per area for both sets of plants, the vertical plants did produce more, and it was really interesting to see how consistent the harvests were throughout the whole harvest season. I think part of this was that the more frequent harvests of the smaller cucumbers happened earlier in the season when there was more warmth and faster growth. And later in the season, the cucumbers would have had a chance to grow larger with the delayed harvests, even though the temperature would have been cooler. And the weight of the cucumbers harvested ended up being fairly consistently about 19 kilograms per week from the full crop, which translated into about 25 jars of pickles that I could make each week. Even with the disease and pest issues cutting short the season, this was a really good crop. But I think it might make more sense to grow a larger area of even more plants for a shorter part of the growing season if I had the space. The harvest would be bigger each week from more plants and with the faster growth from the extra warmth we often get at the beginning of the summer. And then when I had enough, or got bored with it all, or got too busy to keep up with the more frequent harvests, I could simply pull out all the pickling cucumbers and get another crop into the polytunnel space to have a shorter and more intensive pickling season. I think this may be a better option than putting in the work to try to get the plants to produce for longer, which is a strategy that I generally use for the salad cucumbers and a lot of other crops, where I try to produce a fresh crop for a longer part of the season where possible. As with so many other crops, harvesting is the task that takes up the most time with these pickling cucumbers, and it does make a certain amount of sense to put in the extra effort to hang these cucumbers to make the harvesting faster. And I think the regular pruning and the care for the hanging plants will allow them to produce a better crop for longer in the season, if that's what I want. But if I only wanted to produce pickling cucumbers for a shorter period during the hottest part of the Irish summers, then perhaps it's simply easier to let them grow on the surface of the soil, or on a piece of cardboard or a ground cover fabric to keep the cucumbers from touching the soil. I like the idea of seeing this as a quick crop, if I have the space, to get larger harvests for preserving when the conditions are better and the plants are younger. But either way, it's great to be able to produce so many pickling cucumbers and to be able to make so many of our own pickles, especially when living in a place where really good pickles are quite hard to buy. The pickles that I make are starting to become quite popular with friends and neighbors, and it's easy to see how I could expand the area growing pickling cucumbers and to make a lot more pickles for supplying within my community, to turn it into a bit of a side business. But then I need to remind myself that it's more important to focus my time and available polytunnel space and all the trials and explorations that I do into all kinds of different areas of growing food, and to share what I learn and experience through this YouTube channel to help more people grow more of their own food, because that is the purpose of this Red Gardens project. If you would like to support this work and have the spare resources, please check out the links to my Patreon and PayPal account in the video description. Any contribution helps, as does the usual liking, sharing, and subscribing. But more importantly, thank you for watching.